Corporation. And did I miss anyone?
Dave.
Dave Auger, my funny. Ladies and gentlemen, your panelists. We'll start at the end with Dave, who's at the end. Just why don't you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, your experience, and why you deserve a seat at the table today.
You want to go all the way to the end or do Dave? All right. We were going to change name tags and answer each other's questions, and I realized that joke and made it all the way to the end of the table. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the Growup conference for putting this on. My name's Kurt Tusaw. I'm a lawyer, practiced primarily for the last 20 years in the area of medical cannabis litigation. I've had the opportunity to work with a number of different organizations, growers, distributors, and patients that use cannabis for medical purposes. We won a few cases along the way that I think helped, in some respects, pave the way towards demonstrating that it was possible to have a regulated marketplace for the production and distribution of cannabis for both medical and non-medical purposes. And I see a lot of parallels with perhaps where we were, that is to say, essentially a prohibition with some minor exemptions, where we were then compared to where we are now with psychedelic medicine. And so I look forward to exploring a little bit more on this panel where we go from here to try to not have to engage in 20 years of litigation in order to make substantial progress in this area.
Thanks, Kurt. Dave, over to you.
My name is Dave Auger. I've been in the cannabis space since 2013. I sold grow equipment, supplies, and outfitted facilities across North America. I saw psychedelics coming on as a means to a new industry and some excitement, and I've used psychedelics in the past with lots of benefit. Seeing the stuff that's coming out of addictions, I couldn't really ignore it. We built a facility just west of Calgary, Alberta, and have submitted an application for a controlled substance dealer's license there. I'm also in cannabis genetics, and looking forward to speaking with everybody here.
Thank you, Dave. Over to Robert.
Hi, this is on. Yeah, it is. All right. My name's Rob Laurie, and I'm involved in a lot of areas in the cannabis and psychedelic space. I worked with Kirk on some interesting files over the years, but lately I've been doing legal and consulting work and assisting a number of different not-for-profits such as MAPS Canada, Heroic Hearts Project UK, Last Prisoner Project, the Psychedelic Association of Canada. So yeah, I have a practice that covers issues ranging from licensing and corporate commercial through to constitutional and charter considerations. So it's an honor to be here, and let's turn it over to David.
Thank you. Yes, it's very happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Cy. It's nice to get out at the last minute. My name is David Wood. I'm a lawyer and a patent agent, and I started focusing on medical cannabis in 2016 after I got signed up with Aurora to purchase cannabis medically, which was, changed my life, certainly for the better. And then just made a large part of my legal practice at a large law firm where I co-chaired their national cannabis industry focus group, which later became the Psychedelics and Cannabis Industry Focus Group. I'm now general counsel at Psygen. We're a licensed dealer. We're very proud to say we're licensed to manufacture LSD and MDMA and 2CB and DMT and psilocin and psilocybin and mescaline. And we love what we do, and just really happy to be part of the panel.
Jack.
My name is Jack Lloyd. I'm a cannabis and psychedelics lawyer, and also a book editor for a publishing company called Green Candy Press, where I did a book called The Psilocybin Mushroom Ladder. I'm very interested in the development of this.
I'm Heather Koja. I'm a CSO of Service Global Inc. And we have, as Dave mentioned, we have a facility up in Calgary. We at the final stages of our Health Canada license for approval for psychedelics research and development, as well as currently I'm looking forward for looking into the genetic profiling of mushrooms as well as the overall the cannabis industry. Happy to be on panel.
Thank you. The path to legalization for cannabis is one that I think most people often forget. This is a framework we've had in place for close to 3 decades now, beginning with a Superior Court ruling of Superior Court of, was it Canadian Court in Ontario? Or no, Canadian Courts? Court of Appeal. 97 with the court ruling. That went on to the MMAR in 2001, the court ruling in 2011, the MMPR in 2013, and the Yates NPR, followed by the Cannabis Act and the cannabis regulations. So, many of you have previous experience in the industry, so I mean, this one's going to go over to Dave. Considering that when we look at the cannabis legalization pathway that it's taken and the amount of time that it's taken, what are some of the similarities that do you see with psychedelics? Do you see this following a similar path? Is there evidence to suggest that we could potentially one day have a recreational psychedelics market?
Well, I think recreational is a long way off, but I mean we're starting to see some movement somewhere. Health Canada with special access program this year, we're starting to see some movement. Personally, I'm happy to see it staying in a medical vein, at least for the near future. We want, a lot of research. There's a lot of really good research to be done, and just efficacy and safety and all the stuff that we got with cannabis. Following tight regulations is a very similar framework from cannabis. A lot of the strengths that we learned from the cannabis industry play in psychedelics, which is why we've got a whole panel here who all has cannabis experience. So yeah, there's definitely some similarities. It's, if you've got some strength in it, it's a good place to be.
Does the legacy of charter-based litigation for medical cannabis, patients and providers, set any precedents for psychedelic-based mushrooms? This is going to Kirk.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. You gave a little bit of the history of litigation, starting with the seminal decision in R.V. Parker in the Ontario Court of Appeal, which essentially forced the federal government to implement some kind of regulated medical cannabis access scheme, followed by what I used to call in my legal filings the litany of litigation, because it really was about 8 or 9 major charter cases over the course of the next 15 years that paved the way for ultimately what we have today, which is I would say over-regulated market for recreational and medical cannabis. There is ongoing litigation in the mushroom sphere. There are a couple of criminal defense cases in which charter challenges have been launched. There's at least one company, they're still thinking of launching a major challenge on behalf of patients who have been unable to access cannabis for medicinal purposes. I think they're doing some fundraising in that regard, so I encourage you to check that out, because I think it's important litigation. I'm hopeful, as somebody who spent the better part of the last 15 years in court litigating for patient access to medical cannabis, that we don't have that same kind of litany of litigation required to bring about a medical psychedelic scheme. And of course, we have to keep in mind psychedelics is a pretty broad category, obviously. Different individualized compounds or substances that fall within that category are currently regulated in different manners. And so, there's a different metric applied to something like ketamine, which is, actually available by prescription, versus psilocybin, where you have to either jump through the special access program hoops or obtain an exemption directly from Health Canada to access it. So, I see probably more rapid development than in the medical cannabis field for, I would say, 2 reasons. One, we set the groundwork for the charter analysis in those cases, and by and large, that framework of analysis applies to psychedelics with as much or more vigor as it does to cannabis. Generally speaking, safe substances, some level of medicinal benefit. Patients are being criminalized for accessing it in a manner that I would say violates the charter in much the same way that cannabis did. Secondly, the political climate which is, normally where you like to make legislative changes in the political arena, in the legislative arena, not in the judicial arena. It's quicker, it's more direct, it's kind of the way things are supposed to be done. I think we have a much more receptive climate currently in this country to regulatory or legislative change. And so my hope is we don't have the same kind of lengthy, expensive, frankly harmful to patients battles that we have now for medical cannabis when it comes to these other important compounds.
It's well put. Maybe looking to our neighbors to the south, there's perhaps some lessons to be learned, and those lessons are still yet to be delivered. The state of Oregon has recently released draft regulations for their upcoming 23 plans to widely legalize psychedelics, which opens the door to treatment centers for conditions like TRD, treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, other addictions, and in a non-medical setting, without the need for prescriptions, which would be fantastic in improving access. So how do you feel that this might impact the companies and institutions that are pushing through the traditional clinical trial pathway in pursuit of approved therapies? Send that one over to Barbara.
Well, that's a great question. Well, in my practice, I encounter lots of interesting people, and I've gotten to know some folks who, very passionately have been involved with, literally, I call it a race to the bottom, with trying to figure out ways of establishing some of the cheapest dosages for psilocybin. And so a lot of people are looking at mushrooms. Various groups in the States have been looking at, like Dr. Alfred Lund's method of producing mycelium in vats. So effectively, the processes that I've seen are closer to brewing kombucha than growing fruiting mushrooms. And so what's interesting is the program will be interesting because they have been able to get dosages down to 25 cents each with effectively a type of a mycelium syrup that is reduced down into a capsule. And so, if the person that I'm lucky to call a friend is involved with that side of the program. And so interestingly to see, I think a lot of what we're seeing out there is in some regards similar to cannabis, and that cannabis is a bit of a race to the bottom. If you've got 97 plus years of prohibition pricing and then a new market that comes in before truly appreciating legalization versus decriminalization for how to roll that out, certainly will have effect to what I like to the elasticity of these prices. So Oregon will be interesting because that's the first statewide initiative. Now, how they roll it out and whether it will achieve what they want it to is a separate consideration. But isn't it exciting to live in a time where we are seeing grassroots, municipal efforts, state efforts in the case of Oregon, and other countries are following Canada's lead for other types of federal legalization for cannabis. But as Kurt very eloquently pointed out, that litany of litigation, and then I'll just sum up and put it in perspective. Where we are for psilocybin would be the equivalent of R.V. Parker, which so 2001. The equivalent of that in the psychedelic space would be the first Section 56 exemption that was achieved on or about August 4th, 2020. So you look at the starting line there, and in cannabis, as Kirk mentioned, you had 18 years of litigation, also coupled with the fact that this was part of a federal political campaign. I mean, we all remember how hopeful we were with Justin Trudeau in legalizing cannabis. There isn't that same fervor. However, we are at a time with COVID and in an opioid crisis, so there's a huge demand outside of the system and a demand within the system for ways to access these medicines in a way that helps solve public health and public safety. Anyone want to jump in? David?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I like to look at it in that there's no such thing as an illegal drug, right? Like treason is illegal. Drugs might be controlled substances, and you can bring them to market right now. Like you can buy morphine in a store if you have a prescription. If someone wants to do a clinical trial, then they can bring LSD or MDMA to market. MDMA will be a prescription drug probably next year. I mean, I'm sure there's a general awareness in this room of that. Where it gets interesting to me is whether we go beyond the food and drug regulations, like whether it's ever something in addition to or separate from the food and drug regulations. And I think the real main place we might see that maybe, and I don't think any of us should count on it, but hopefully it does happen. I hope it does happen, certainly, is with psilocybin, because it's going to be simpler, I think, from a regulatory perspective, and simpler from a societal perspective to let psilocybin have a role in our economy and in our lives outside of prescription drugs. With other psychedelics, personally, I'd be much more conservative. I just think with psilocybin, there's something about it that you could kind of regulate it the same way, right? Like you could, if there was the political will, it wouldn't be hard. I do pro bono work with Therasil. We've proposed regulations along those lines to the government that would be under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which means
The APNPR. The APNPR.
That's right.
The
Yeah.
access to psilocybin for medical purposes regulations.
Yep.
Okay.
We're not creative at all with the title. We took the
That's fine.
APNPR to switch. Yeah. We did a little more than find and replace. There's a bit more thought than that in it, but the main point is that they're consistent with UN obligations.
I was curious if you folks had considered what a psilocybin symbol would look like.
I think it'd be something to do with, the mind and an explosion or rocket horizons.
Fantastic. In the last year, we've seen over 50 companies go public in the psychedelic space. They're claiming to be in the psychedelic space. Most of these companies don't have sort of brick and mortar locations, offices, any products for sale. Really aren't doing anything besides getting an idea and finding investors. We're seeing a lot of similarities between what cannabis looked like pre-2018, pre-our legalization. So Jack, I'm just wondering, what do you think this is going to happen? Is this going to be a similar situation to what we saw with Canadian cannabis? Are people just going to be investing for the hopes of maybe getting out or acquiring 100,000 square foot greenhouses?
That's a really interesting question. My practice is largely litigation in relation to cannabis and psychedelics, so I don't generally represent publicly traded companies, but I will say that a sea change in the way that psilocybin is regulated certainly would have an effect on any public company. So part of the Section 56 exemption that Robert mentioned, I think is an effort on the part of the federal government to stop litigation in the psilocybin space. I think in a sense the federal legislation is very vulnerable to a constitutional challenge based on Section 7 of the Charter, just because of the very, very serious research coming out of universities regarding the effectiveness of psilocybin in treating depression and a variety of other ailments. So if a criminal case, and I represent a lot of people that get in trouble for growing or selling psilocybin, and almost immediately when you file a notice of constitutional question in regards to the validity of the prohibition, you're getting charges stayed. And I think there may be like a memo floating around it with the federal government to just keep, to prevent the apple cart from being turned over. So I think that, there may be a lot of speculation on the parts of public companies that are looking at the space, particularly because people are getting access through what's called the Special Access Program and through the Section 56 exemption program. So I'm hesitant to say that it's largely speculative, but certainly they would be in a very good position if such a case were successful. So I don't know if it's a bubble, but certainly the underlying argument that is supporting those companies is quite strong. I'd say that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question to throw to you because you're not working for any of these publicly traded companies, right? So, is Cygen public? No? No, it's prevalent. Okay. Health Canada recently made a communication in which they had indicated that substances such as mushrooms, the mushroom substrate itself, would be able to be used for clinical trial research, which is a little bit different than what we might have expected when we look at the process of getting a DIN number, drug identification, and what we're using pure compounds at a specific dosage. So this question's for Dr. Hyder. I'm curious, with combinations of psychotropic drugs, how would you evaluate something like that from a trial perspective, and can combinations be used to cure illnesses?
So I think the first thing is like the research. If the law needs to govern the legalization, they need to relax the law towards the research and development of psychedelics or any psychedelics, so that ease the burden from the research scientists to do a lot of work and come up with therapeutic potentials from the literature reviews, going back to clinical trials. Because if an application for dealer's license takes a year and a half, so then you can expect that how many applications are pending so far. For cannabis time, when cannabis started, like 1,400 applications, if I'm vaguely saying, when filed, there are 365 days in a year, and then every day if they do one application, it will take about a year for them to do an application process. So it's too much of the burden on Health Canada. And then within the Health Canada, there are experts who knows, who are there. Maybe there are administrators who are looking into your file and coming back with questions and answers for you and taking further time. I think the regulations should be eased towards the research and development first, and the second thing is looking into the combination drug therapy. Since cannabis is already a part of this legislation, or has a relax into it, the combination drug therapy probably would help at this moment to just expedite the psilocybin and combination drug therapy with the cannabis industry. So.
Or perhaps go one step further than what British Columbia has done on the decriminalization part, and perhaps provide safe access to all drugs, and then perhaps invest money that you have in enforcement and social programs. I'm curious, would anyone at the table here feel that would be a more suitable approach to how we've handled the drug epidemic in Canada and beyond?
Yes.
Well, the precedent for it is safe injection sites. So look at where you would be in a scenario of greater harm and externalities and economic and social political considerations of are there greater harm with or without safe injection. So I think the way that this is all going to go medical before there's even any hint or talk of recreational access is because of the framework already exists. It's jumping through extra hoops that are there because of larger international policy concerns, which will be interesting as the United States seems to be getting more and more engaged with this cannabis debate and the psychedelic initiatives in that country. It'll be interesting because let's not forget it was largely the United States, which brought a lot of these policies. I mean, with psychedelics, it kind of goes back to one man, Richard Nixon in 1971, which ironically was the first time in psychedelics, and I have to quote Mark Hayden, the former executive director of MAPS for this, but in the Nixon era, 1971, Vietnam, that was the first time in history that psychedelics were deemed antisocial.
Consumers' confidence in what they're obtaining. In other words, you can't just decriminalize possession without putting into place some sort of framework for safe access, because that's kind of, in some ways, it's not worse than prohibition, but it certainly doesn't make the situation on the ground much safer in terms of what's in the things that you're
licenses at stake. You're kind of backing that therapist into a corner. It's not fair to ask them to do that when it could mean they lose their license, unless they want to prove a point, hire Kirk and work it out. But for most people who just want to do their work, if there's a way for them to access it in the nature of what Kirk's describing, then it's possible for the regulator to be okay
by the Crown Prosecution Service or the prosecuting office in the States, where they realize we're tying up too many resources with people who should be diverted out of the criminal justice system and into something else. So that is largely, we heard jump in, or Jack. But traditionally, when you talk about decriminalization and what we've been seeing in Vancouver, that's not really being done with any type of design or encouragement of, or the creation of any kind of regulated industry. It's dealing with another issue with regards to access to criminal justice in a timely manner.